"Ma'am, I'm sorry, but your name isn't on the guest list," the young man at the entrance said, his finger slowly sliding down the printed page as if hoping my name might suddenly appear between the lines. I stood there with my small navy handbag resting against my hip and my cane steady in my right hand, certain there had been some simple mistake. My grandson Ethan was graduating that afternoon, the first in our family to finish high school with honors, and I had been looking forward to that moment for months. I had even chosen my dress carefully that morning, a modest navy blue one with pearl buttons, the same dress my late husband Thomas used to say made me look dignified. The sun was warm on the concrete outside the stadium, the kind of bright June afternoon that made the sky look almost impossibly blue, and families were streaming past me carrying balloons, flowers, and cameras. I watched parents hug their children, grandparents wipe tears from their eyes, little siblings running ahead with excitement. It should have been a joyful scene, but suddenly I felt like I was standing outside a celebration that had somehow forgotten I existed. I leaned slightly closer to the table where the staff member was checking tickets. "Could you check again?" I asked gently. "My grandson is Ethan Whitmore." The young man was polite. He looked again, slowly, carefully, as if searching harder might fix the situation. Then he gave me the same apologetic smile. "I'm really sorry, ma'am. I don't see your name here." For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the noise of the crowd wash around me. My grandson Ethan. My son Daniel's boy. The little baby I had rocked to sleep so many nights when Daniel and his wife were both working late. I remembered Ethan at 5 years old building towers from cereal boxes in my kitchen. I remembered helping him practice spelling words at my dining table. I remembered the way he used to run into my arms every Sunday afternoon when his parents dropped him off for dinner. That same boy was walking across a graduation stage today, and somehow his own grandmother wasn't on the list to watch him do it. I told myself it had to be an administrative error. Schools made mistakes all the time. Papers got mixed up. Names got misspelled. But something inside my chest tightened when I glanced through the open stadium gate and looked toward the rows of seats near the front. And that was when I saw them. Daniel was sitting 2 rows from the stage, wearing the same gray blazer he always wore to important events. Next to him sat my daughter-in-law, Aisha, her posture perfectly straight, her dark hair falling over one shoulder as she leaned slightly forward in her chair. They looked comfortable, prepared, like they had been sitting there for quite a while, as if they had expected to be there all along. I raised my hand instinctively, thinking maybe Daniel would notice me standing outside the gate. But before he could look up, Aisha did. Our eyes met across the distance. For a second, she didn't move at all. Her expression didn't show surprise. It didn't show concern. It showed recognition. She had seen me. She knew exactly where I was standing. And then she did something very small that felt strangely deliberate. She turned her head away. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a quiet, casual movement, as if the person standing outside the gate simply wasn't someone she needed to acknowledge. I lowered my hand slowly. Around me the crowd continued flowing through the entrance. A little girl brushed past me holding a bouquet almost as big as her arms. A father laughed loudly while adjusting a camera strap around his neck. No one noticed the old woman standing beside the check-in table, holding a small silver gift box that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. The young staff member looked at me again, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he repeated softly. I nodded to show him it was all right. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. I turned away from the stadium and began walking slowly toward the parking lot, the rubber tip of my cane tapping gently against the pavement with each step. The ceremony music began playing behind me just as I reached the sidewalk. And as I listened to the applause echoing from inside the stadium, one quiet question kept repeating in my mind. If my name had been on the list before, who had decided it shouldn't be there today? I did not go home right away. I sat in my car in the far corner of the parking lot, the silver gift box still resting in my lap, while the late afternoon sun slowly shifted across the windshield. The stadium speakers echoed faintly through the warm air, and every few minutes I could hear bursts of applause from inside, the sound rolling across the campus like distant thunder. Each round of clapping meant another group of students had walked across that stage. Somewhere in there, my grandson Ethan was probably standing in his blue graduation gown, waiting for his name to be called. I imagined the moment the announcer would say, "Ethan Whitmore," and the crowd would cheer. Daniel would clap proudly. Aisha would smile for photographs. Cameras would flash, and my seat would remain empty, not because I chose to stay away, but because someone had made sure I could not walk through that gate. I placed my hand on the small gift box and traced the ribbon slowly with my thumb. Inside was a silver compass, engraved with Ethan's initials and the date of his graduation. I had ordered it 3 weeks earlier after finding it in a small shop downtown. The engraving had taken 10 days to finish. I remembered how carefully the clerk wrapped it in tissue paper before placing it in the box, telling me it was a popular gift for young people starting a new chapter in life. At the time I had smiled and said, "My grandson is going to love this." I believed that completely. Ethan had always been a thoughtful boy. Even after he grew older and school became busier, he still called me sometimes just to ask how I was doing. On my last birthday, he had shown up at my front door with a chocolate cake and a card written in his careful handwriting. That was why what happened today did not make sense to me. Ethan would never leave me out of something like this on purpose, which meant the decision had been made somewhere else. I leaned back in the driver's seat and closed my eyes for a moment, letting memories drift through my mind. When Daniel married Aisha 8 years ago, I truly believed our family had gained something wonderful. She was confident, intelligent, and very organized. She always seemed to know exactly how events should be planned and how schedules should run. At first I admired that about her. During the early months of their marriage, she would call me often, asking questions about Daniel's childhood or family traditions. She sounded warm and respectful, and I remember thinking how lucky my son was to have a wife who cared about keeping the family connected. But over time, small things began to change. Invitations became less frequent. Holiday dinners were suddenly described as small gatherings. Sometimes I would hear about family plans only after they had already happened. When I asked Daniel about it, he usually sounded surprised and would say something simple like, "Mom, I thought Aisha told you." I always assumed it was a misunderstanding. After all, families get busy. People forget things. Life moves quickly. That was what I told myself every time another invitation quietly disappeared. Yet sitting there in that quiet parking lot, listening to the distant applause from inside the stadium, I felt something settling into place in my mind. It was the kind of realization that arrived slowly, like puzzle pieces finally connecting after years of being scattered across the table. One moment in particular came back to me clearly. Last Thanksgiving, Daniel had mentioned that Aisha was handling all of the guest registrations for Ethan's graduation ceremony, because the school required families to submit their names weeks in advance. At the time, I had not thought twice about it. Aisha loved organizing things. She managed calendars, reservations, and travel plans for the whole household. Of course, she would be the one submitting the list. I opened my eyes and looked down again at the silver gift box resting quietly in my lap. The ribbon had come loose while I sat there, one end curling over the side of the lid. Inside the stadium, another wave of applause erupted, louder than before. That was probably the moment Ethan crossed the stage. I pictured him smiling, holding his diploma, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Perhaps he expected to see me somewhere in those rows of seats. Perhaps he wondered why I was not there. The thought tightened something deep in my chest, but it also brought with it a strange calmness. Because the more I considered the situation, the more certain I became of one thing. Ethan had not erased my name from that guest list. Someone else had done that. And in our family, there was only one person who had both the responsibility and the authority to make a change like that without anyone questioning it. I remained in the car until the ceremony ended. When the stadium doors finally opened, families poured out onto the sidewalks in waves of celebration. I watched them from across the parking lot as parents lifted bouquets of flowers and students hugged their friends while posing for photographs. The late afternoon sunlight turned everything golden, and laughter carried easily through the warm air. I saw Daniel eventually emerge from the stadium entrance with his phone raised, clearly recording something. A few seconds later, Ethan appeared beside him, still wearing his graduation gown and holding his diploma. My grandson looked taller than I remembered, his shoulders broader, his smile bright with pride and relief. For a moment, my instinct was to step out of the car and call his name. I almost did. My hand even moved toward the door handle before I stopped myself. Because standing just beside Ethan was Aisha. She adjusted Ethan's cap gently, brushing something off his shoulder with the careful attention of someone making sure every detail looked perfect for photographs. Daniel placed his arm around Ethan while Aisha held her phone out to capture the moment. The three of them stood together, laughing and turning toward different angles as relatives gathered around them. It looked like a complete picture of a happy family. The only thing missing was me. I stayed where I was and watched quietly from a distance of about 50 yards. No one noticed the old sedan parked under the shade of a maple tree. No one looked in my direction. After a few minutes, the group began walking toward the far side of the parking lot, where Daniel's black sport utility vehicle was parked. Ethan stopped once to shake hands with one of his teachers. The teacher said something that made Ethan laugh before patting him proudly on the shoulder. Watching that small exchange reminded me of the afternoons Ethan used to sit at my kitchen table doing homework while I prepared dinner. He had always been a good student, curious and patient. I used to tell him that finishing school was like reaching the top of a hill after a long climb. Once you reach the top, the whole world opened in front of you. Today was supposed to be that moment for him, and I had wanted to be there when it happened. When Daniel's vehicle finally pulled out of the lot, the crowd began thinning quickly. Within 15 minutes, the celebration outside the stadium had mostly disappeared, leaving behind scattered paper programs and a few forgotten balloons drifting near the fences. I started the engine of my car and drove slowly toward the exit road that led back to the highway. The town looked peaceful as I passed through it. The local diner was busy with families celebrating early dinners, and the gas station on Main Street had a line of cars waiting at the pumps. Life moved forward the same way it always did. Yet something inside my mind continued replaying the moment when the young staff member told me my name was not on the list. I thought about how calmly Aisha had turned her head away when she saw me standing at the gate. It had not been a look of surprise. It had been the look of someone who already knew exactly what was happening. By the time I reached my driveway, the sky was beginning to turn soft shades of orange and pink. I carried the small silver gift box inside the house and placed it carefully on the kitchen table. The house was quiet, just the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock near the hallway. I sat down in my usual chair and looked at the box for a long time. The ribbon had loosened even more during the drive home, and the lid shifted slightly when I touched it. I lifted it slowly and opened the box again, revealing the silver compass inside. The engraving caught the evening light perfectly. Ethan Whitmore, class of 2024. I traced the letters gently with my fingertip and felt a calm certainty settle into my thoughts. Someone had removed my name from that guest list, and whoever did it believed the change would go unnoticed. But families have a way of revealing their truths over time, especially when silence replaces honesty. And the more I thought about everything that had happened over the past few years, the clearer one realization became. Today had not been an accident. It had been the result of a decision. And decisions always leave traces behind them if you know where to look. I did not sleep much that night. The house felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound stand out. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen, and the old wall clock ticked with steady patience as if it had been keeping the same rhythm for 50 years. I sat at the kitchen table long after sunset, the silver compass still resting in its open box in front of me. Every few minutes I glanced toward the front window, half expecting headlights to appear in the driveway or my phone to ring with Ethan's voice asking why I had not come to the ceremony. But the night remained still. No calls, no messages. Eventually, I closed the box and carried it to the living room, placing it carefully on the wooden side table beside the couch where Thomas used to sit every evening reading the newspaper. For a moment, I stood there looking at his empty chair. It had been 3 years since my husband passed away, yet sometimes the room still felt as if he had just stepped outside for a moment and would return any minute. Thomas had always been the steady center of our family. When Daniel was younger, he used to say that his father could fix any problem with patience and a quiet conversation. I remembered one evening many years ago when Daniel was about 12 years old and had gotten into trouble at school for arguing with a teacher. Daniel had come home angry and embarrassed, slamming his backpack on the kitchen floor and insisting that the whole situation was unfair. Thomas did not raise his voice. He simply sat Daniel down at the table and asked him to explain everything step by step. By the end of the conversation, Daniel had calmed down and realized that understanding the full story mattered more than reacting to the first emotion that appeared. That was how Thomas handled most things in life. He believed that when something confusing happened, the best response was to gather the facts quietly before drawing conclusions. I tried to follow that same approach as I walked slowly through the house that evening. The living room still held photographs from different chapters of our family life. One picture showed Daniel at his college graduation nearly 30 years earlier, standing between Thomas and me with a wide, proud grin. Another photograph showed Ethan at age 7 holding a fishing rod beside the lake. During a summer weekend at our cabin, I paused in front of that picture longer than the others. Ethan had caught his first fish that day, and he had been so excited that he ran halfway down the dock shouting for me to come see it. That was the boy I knew. Curious, enthusiastic, always eager to share good news. The thought that he might believe I simply chose not to attend his graduation did not feel right. I walked to the hallway desk and opened the small drawer where I kept old notebooks and letters. Inside was a calendar from earlier in the year. I flipped through the pages until I reached the week when Daniel mentioned the graduation guest registration. I remembered the conversation clearly. We had been finishing dinner at Daniel's house, and Aisha had explained that the school required families to submit a list of guests several weeks before the ceremony, because seating was limited. She had spoken confidently, saying she would handle the registration forms online to make sure everything was organized properly. At the time it had sounded perfectly reasonable. Now, standing in the quiet hallway of my home with that memory echoing in my mind, the detail felt different. If Aisha had been responsible for submitting the names, then she had also been responsible for confirming that those names remained on the list. The realization did not come with anger. It came with the calm clarity Thomas used to talk about when he said that facts eventually reveal their own pattern. I closed the calendar and returned it to the drawer, then walked back into the living room and turned off the lamp beside the couch. The house grew darker except for the faint light coming from the kitchen window. Tomorrow would bring new conversations and new information. But tonight one truth had already begun to settle quietly in my mind. What happened at that stadium gate had not been random, and the answer to why it happened was much closer to home than anyone might expect. I woke early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen over the rooftops of our quiet street. The house still carried the cool calm of early morning, and for a moment I simply sat at the edge of my bed listening to the faint sound of birds outside the window. My mind returned immediately to the events of the previous afternoon, but the confusion I had felt at the stadium gate was slowly being replaced by something steadier. I moved through my morning routine the same way Thomas and I had done for decades. I brewed a small pot of coffee, toasted a slice of bread, and carried my cup to the kitchen table where the sunlight was beginning to stretch across the floorboards. The silver gift box remained where I had placed it the night before. Seeing it there reminded me again that Ethan might believe I had simply chosen not to attend his graduation. That idea did not sit well with me. Ethan deserved the truth, and so did I. I reached for my phone and considered calling Daniel. For several seconds my thumb hovered over his name on the screen. Then I set the phone down again. Daniel had always been quick to explain situations in ways that made them sound smaller than they really were. If I asked him directly what happened, I suspected I would hear the same familiar answer I had heard before. Some kind of mix-up, some harmless misunderstanding. But this time I wanted to understand the facts before hearing anyone's explanation. After finishing my coffee, I walked to the small desk near the hallway and turned on the old computer Thomas used for years to manage household documents. The screen glowed softly as it came to life. I opened the internet browser and typed the name of Ethan's high school into the search bar. The school website appeared quickly, displaying a photograph of the stadium filled with graduates in bright blue gowns. I clicked through several pages until I found the section describing the graduation ceremony and guest registration process. The information was written very clearly. Families were required to submit their guest names through an online form several weeks before the ceremony. Each graduate could register up to 6 guests. Once submitted, the list could only be modified by contacting the school administration office. I read the instructions twice, then a third time. Each sentence felt like another small piece falling into place. If the list had been submitted weeks earlier, and if changes required direct contact with the administration office, then the removal of my name could not have happened accidentally at the stadium entrance. It would have required someone deliberately asking for that change to be made. I sat quietly for a few minutes thinking about that detail. Finally, I opened the school directory page and located the phone number for the administration office. The call connected after 2 rings. A pleasant voice answered, introducing herself as the school receptionist. I explained that my grandson had graduated the day before and that I had a small question about the guest list process. I kept my tone calm and respectful, the same way Thomas always did when asking for information. The receptionist listened carefully and then placed me on a brief hold while she checked the records. The silence that followed felt longer than it probably was. I watched a beam of sunlight move slowly across the kitchen wall while waiting for her to return to the line. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded slightly more thoughtful. She explained that the original guest list for Ethan Whitmore had indeed been submitted several weeks earlier, with 6 names included. She paused for a moment before adding that there had been one update to the list 2 days before the ceremony. My heart remained steady as I listened. Years of life experience had taught me that important truths often arrive quietly. The receptionist continued speaking, explaining that one name had been removed at the request of a family member who contacted the administration office directly. She said the change had been processed without issue because the request came from the person listed as the primary contact for Ethan's graduation registration. I thanked her politely for checking the information and ended the call. For a long moment, I remained seated at the kitchen table with the phone resting gently in my hand. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. A delivery truck rumbled down the street, and somewhere nearby a lawn mower started humming. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. But now one thing had become very clear in my mind. Someone had not simply forgotten to include my name. Someone had asked for it to be removed. I remained seated at the kitchen table for several minutes after ending the call, the phone still resting quietly in my hand. The morning light had grown brighter, filling the room with a warm glow that made the wooden floorboards shine softly. Yet inside my mind, everything felt unusually calm, almost methodical, the same way Thomas used to become when he was working through a complicated problem. The receptionist had not told me the name of the person who requested the change, but she had given me something far more important than that. She had confirmed that the change existed. My name had once been on the guest list, and 2 days before the ceremony someone had asked the school to remove it. I placed the phone on the table and looked again at the silver gift box beside my coffee cup. The compass inside had been meant to mark a proud moment in Ethan's life, a small symbol of direction and possibility as he stepped into adulthood. Instead, it had become a quiet reminder of how easily truth could be hidden when people believed no one would look closely enough. I opened the box again and lifted the compass into my palm. The metal felt cool and solid, its polished surface reflecting the sunlight coming through the window. Thomas used to say that a compass only works if you hold it steady and allow the needle to settle. If you shake it or rush it, the direction becomes impossible to read. That thought stayed with me as I returned the compass to its box. I did not feel anger. I felt clarity. For years I had assumed that small misunderstandings explained the distance that slowly formed between me and Daniel's household. Invitations that never arrived. Holidays that suddenly became private gatherings. Conversations that seemed slightly incomplete. I had accepted each explanation because families are complicated, and it is easy to believe that busy schedules create confusion. But what happened at the graduation ceremony could not be explained by forgetfulness. Someone had taken the time to contact the school administration office and request a change. That action required intention, and intention always has a reason behind it. I stood up from the table and carried the empty coffee cup to the sink. The quiet routine of washing the cup helped me organize my thoughts. When I finished, I returned to the living room and picked up the phone again. This time I did not call Daniel. Instead, I opened the messaging screen and typed a short message to Ethan. I congratulated him on his graduation and told him how proud I was of his hard work over the years. I kept the message simple and warm. Exactly the kind of note a grandmother would send on such an important day. After sending it, I placed the phone back on the table and waited. I did not have to wait long. Within 10 minutes the phone chimed with a reply. Ethan thanked me for the message and said he had been wondering why he did not see me at the ceremony. He wrote that he looked for me in the crowd when his name was called and assumed maybe I had been seated farther back in the stadium. Reading those words confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. Ethan had expected me to be there. He had not known about the change to the guest list. I typed another message telling him that I had tried to attend, but that there had been a small problem with the registration at the entrance. I did not include details. Ethan was celebrating a milestone in his life. and there would be time later to discuss the full story. His next reply arrived quickly. He said that he was coming by the house later that afternoon to show me his diploma and spend some time together. I set the phone down once more and looked around the quiet room. Outside the window, the neighborhood was fully awake now. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk, and a neighbor across the street watered her garden. Everything looked peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface, I understood something clearly for the first time. The person who removed my name from that guest list believed the decision would remain invisible, but the truth had already begun revealing itself piece by piece. And when the right moment arrived, that truth would no longer remain hidden. I spent the late morning preparing the house the same way I always did when Ethan came to visit. The routine was simple but comforting. I wiped the kitchen table, set out 2 clean glasses, and placed the silver gift box near the center where the sunlight from the window could touch the lid. The house felt brighter than it had the night before, almost as if the quiet certainty in my mind had brought a different kind of energy into the room. Around 2 o'clock, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. A moment later, the front door opened, and Ethan stepped inside, still carrying the same excited energy that had followed him since he was a child. His graduation gown was folded neatly over one arm, and a wide smile spread across his face the moment he saw me. He crossed the room quickly and wrapped his arms around me in a careful hug, mindful of my balance and my cane. He smelled faintly of fresh air and the grassy field behind the stadium. For a second, I simply held him, letting the warmth of that moment settle the last lingering doubts in my mind. This was still the same grandson who had spent countless afternoons at my kitchen table doing homework and asking questions about the world. When we pulled apart, he held up the diploma proudly and said he wanted me to see it first. I examined the document carefully, tracing the printed letters of his name the same way I had traced the engraving on the compass earlier that morning. I told him how proud I was of the young man he had become. Ethan's smile softened then, and he glanced around the room before asking the question I had expected. He said he kept looking for me in the stadium crowd when his name was called. He thought maybe I had been sitting somewhere he could not see. I sat down slowly in my chair and motioned for him to sit across from me at the table. I explained that I had arrived at the stadium on time, but that the staff member at the entrance could not find my name on the guest list. Ethan frowned immediately, confusion spreading across his face. He said that could not be right because he remembered clearly telling his parents that I would be there. I watched him carefully as he spoke. His reaction was genuine, the kind that cannot be rehearsed or hidden. That confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Ethan had expected me to attend. After a moment, he asked if the school had made some kind of mistake. I shook my head gently and told him that I had spoken with the administration office earlier that morning. I explained that my name had originally been on the list, but that someone had requested it be removed 2 days before the ceremony. The room grew very quiet when I said that. Ethan leaned back in his chair, trying to process the information. I could see the same thoughtful expression on his face that his grandfather used to have when something important needed careful consideration. He asked who would have the authority to make that change. I told him the school records showed that the request came from the primary contact listed for his graduation registration. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the table, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the silver gift box. Finally, he spoke in a low voice and said that the registration had been handled by his mother because she organized all the paperwork for family events. The sentence hung quietly in the air between us. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. I opened the gift box and slid the compass toward him. Ethan lifted it carefully, reading the engraving with a mixture of pride and disbelief. He thanked me and turned the compass slowly in his hands, watching the needle settle into place. I told him that a compass always points in the direction of truth if you give it enough time to steady itself. Ethan looked up at me then, understanding beginning to form behind his eyes. In that quiet kitchen, with sunlight spilling across the table and the compass resting between us, we both realized that the story behind the missing name had only just begun to reveal itself. I could see Ethan thinking carefully as he turned the compass in his hands, watching the small needle settle into its steady position. The kitchen had grown quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan lifted his eyes and asked a question that carried more weight than he probably realized. He asked if I thought his mother had removed my name on purpose. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached for the teapot on the stove and poured us both a cup of tea, the gentle routine giving my thoughts a moment to settle. Thomas used to say that the truth reveals itself best when people are calm enough to see it clearly. I placed the cup in front of Ethan and sat down again. I told him that sometimes people make decisions for reasons they believe are justified at the time, but those decisions can still hurt others. Ethan listened quietly, the way he always had when something important was being explained. After a moment, he said that his mother had been very particular about organizing the graduation ceremony. She handled the guest registration forms, the dinner reservation afterward, and even the seating arrangement for the family celebration that evening. Ethan admitted that he had not looked at the guest list himself because he trusted everything had already been taken care of. Hearing that confirmed what I had begun to suspect the moment the school receptionist described the change to the records. Ethan rested the compass on the table and leaned forward slightly. He said he planned to ask his mother about the list when he returned home later that evening. I nodded slowly, but reminded him that conversations like that were better handled with patience rather than anger. Accusations rarely lead to honest answers. Ethan agreed, though I could see the determination forming behind his calm expression. Before leaving, he slipped the compass carefully into his pocket and hugged me again at the door. As he walked down the driveway, I noticed that his steps were slower than when he had arrived, as if his mind was already working through the pieces of the story. The house grew quiet again after his car disappeared around the corner. I returned to the kitchen and sat at the table where the sunlight was beginning to shift toward the far wall. Hours passed peacefully as I read a book and watered the small plants near the window. Around early evening, my phone rang. The caller identification showed Daniel's name. I answered calmly and greeted him the way I always did. His voice sounded unusually tense as he asked whether Ethan had visited me that afternoon. I told him that he had stopped by to show me his diploma and spend some time talking. There was a pause on the line before Daniel spoke again. He said that Ethan had returned home with questions about the guest list for the ceremony. Daniel explained that Aisha had handled all of the graduation arrangements and that there must have been some misunderstanding with the school administration office. I listened quietly without interrupting, allowing him to finish his explanation. When he paused, I told him gently that I had already spoken with the administration office myself. I explained that the records showed my name had been removed from the list 2 days before the ceremony at the request of the primary contact for the registration. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted several seconds longer this time. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. He said he would need to discuss the situation with Aisha to understand what had happened. I told him that I believed clarity would come soon enough. After the call ended, I set the phone back on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the evening sky, turning shades of soft blue and orange. Somewhere across town, Ethan was probably sitting with his parents having a conversation that had been delayed longer than anyone realized. I did not know exactly what would be said in that room, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Once a hidden decision becomes visible, it is only a matter of time before the truth behind it begins to surface. I woke the next morning to the soft gray light of early dawn spreading across the kitchen floor, the same quiet light that had greeted me the day before. The house felt peaceful, yet there was a new sense of anticipation in the air, as if something important had begun moving beneath the surface of our family's life. I prepared my coffee slowly and sat at the table, allowing the silence to settle around me. The events of the previous evening replayed calmly in my thoughts. Daniel had sounded unsettled on the phone after learning that I had already spoken with the school administration office. His voice carried the tone of someone realizing that a simple explanation might not be enough this time. Around 9 o'clock, my phone vibrated softly on the table. It was Ethan. His message was brief but thoughtful. He wrote that he had spoken with his parents after returning home, and that the conversation had not gone the way he expected. I could almost hear his voice in the careful way the words were written. He explained that when he asked his mother about the guest list, she initially told him that there must have been a mistake at the school. According to her, she had submitted all the names correctly weeks earlier and had no reason to remove anyone. Ethan said that his father had accepted that explanation quickly, assuming it was simply an administrative error. But Ethan had asked another question that made the room fall quiet. He asked why the school records specifically showed that the removal request came from the primary contact for the registration. And since his mother had handled the registration, that primary contact could only be her. Ethan wrote that when he said this, his mother became noticeably uncomfortable. She told him that sometimes schools change lists without notifying families, and that the situation was probably the result of some internal mistake. Yet Ethan could tell something about the explanation did not feel right. I set the phone down and looked out the window toward the quiet street. A gentle breeze moved the branches of the maple tree near the sidewalk, and a pair of sparrows hopped along the grass in the front yard. Ordinary details of an ordinary morning. Yet the truth that had begun surfacing the day before was continuing to move forward in small but steady steps. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Ethan calling directly. When I answered, his voice sounded calm but thoughtful. He told me that he had spent most of the evening replaying the conversation with his mother and father in his mind. The more he considered it, the more he felt that something about the situation had been deliberately hidden from him. Ethan said that his mother had always been careful about managing family appearances. She liked everything to look organized and controlled, especially during public events like graduations or celebrations. I listened quietly while he spoke, recognizing a tone in his voice that reminded me of Thomas when he was carefully assembling pieces of information into a clear picture. Ethan then said something that made me pause for a moment. He told me that during the discussion the previous night, his father eventually admitted that he had never personally looked at the guest list before the ceremony. Daniel had simply trusted that everything had been arranged properly. That meant the only person who truly knew the details of the list before the ceremony was Aisha. Ethan said he planned to speak with his mother again later that day when things were calmer. He did not want to argue with her. He wanted to understand why the change had been made. After we ended the call, I sat quietly with my coffee and reflected on how quickly the situation had shifted. Only a day earlier, I had been standing alone outside the stadium gate, wondering whether the absence of my name had been an accident. Now the question had grown much larger than a simple administrative error. The truth was moving steadily through our family conversations, and once people begin asking careful questions, answers eventually follow. I did not know exactly what explanation would emerge, but I knew something important had already changed. Ethan had begun searching for the truth himself, and that meant the story behind the missing name could no longer remain hidden in silence. I spent the rest of that day moving through the quiet rhythm of ordinary life, but my thoughts continued circling the same question that had followed me since the graduation ceremony. By mid-afternoon, the sunlight had shifted across the living room floor, and I had just finished watering the plants near the window when my phone rang again. This time the caller identification showed Ethan's name. His voice sounded steadier than it had earlier that morning, yet there was a seriousness beneath it that told me something important had happened. He said he had spoken with his mother again after lunch, and the conversation had finally revealed more than the one from the night before. According to Ethan, the discussion began calmly enough. He simply asked her one more time if she had contacted the school about the guest list. At first, she repeated the same explanation she had given earlier, saying the school must have made an internal error. But Ethan told me that he had already confirmed with the administration office that the removal request had come from the primary contact listed on the registration form. When he said this, his mother became very quiet. Ethan described the moment in careful detail. His father was sitting at the kitchen table, listening but not speaking. The room felt tense in the way that family rooms sometimes do when everyone knows the conversation has reached an uncomfortable truth. Finally, his mother admitted that she had indeed called the school 2 days before the ceremony. But the explanation she offered next surprised Ethan even more than the admission itself. She said she had removed my name because she believed the ceremony would be easier for everyone if the guest list remained limited to immediate household members. According to her reasoning, the stadium seating was crowded and the family dinner afterward had already reached the maximum reservation number at the restaurant. Ethan told me that when she said this, he reminded her that each graduate had been allowed 6 guest registrations, and that our family had only used 5 seats at the ceremony. There had been room for me all along. When Ethan pointed this out, his mother explained that she believed it would be simpler to avoid potential disagreements by quietly adjusting the list. Ethan said that was the moment he realized the decision had not been about seating or reservations at all. It had been a choice made without telling him or his father beforehand. Listening to Ethan describe the conversation, I felt the calm certainty I had carried since the morning grow even clearer. People often reveal their intentions through the explanations they choose after the truth surfaces. Ethan continued speaking, telling me that his father had looked genuinely surprised during the discussion. Daniel admitted he had not known about the change, and that he had assumed all of the graduation arrangements had remained exactly as originally planned. For several minutes, no one in the room had spoken. Eventually, Ethan asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment he stood on the graduation stage looking for me in the crowd. He asked his mother why she had not simply told him she planned to remove my name. According to Ethan, she answered by saying she thought it would avoid unnecessary tension within the family. When Ethan finished telling me the story, the line grew quiet again. I could hear the faint background sound of cars passing outside his house. Finally, he said something that carried both disappointment and understanding. He said he had never imagined that a decision like that would be made without his knowledge, especially on a day that meant so much to him. I listened carefully before answering. I told him that families sometimes struggle with decisions about inclusion and control, especially when someone believes they are protecting their own version of harmony. But the most important thing was that the truth had now been spoken openly. Ethan agreed. He said that regardless of the explanation, he believed the situation should have been handled with honesty from the beginning. After the call ended, I placed the phone on the table and looked around the quiet room once more. The story that began at the stadium gate had reached an important turning point. The missing name on the guest list was no longer a mystery hidden behind silence. It had become a decision that everyone in the family now understood, and once truth becomes visible in that way, it has a way of changing the direction of every conversation that follows. I slept well that night for the first time since the graduation ceremony. When morning arrived, the house felt lighter, as if the truth that had slowly unfolded during the past 2 days had cleared something heavy from the air. I made my usual cup of coffee and carried it to the front porch where the early sunlight warmed the wooden steps. Across the street, my neighbor was walking her dog, and a delivery truck rolled quietly past the corner. Life looked simple again, yet I knew our family had crossed an invisible line. Once honesty enters a conversation, it changes how everyone sees the past. Around mid-morning, my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. His voice sounded different from our earlier conversations. There was less certainty in it and more reflection. He said that after speaking with Ethan the previous evening, he had spent a long time talking with Aisha about the decision she made. According to Daniel, she admitted that removing my name had not been about seating or restaurant reservations at all. She had believed that keeping the event limited to what she called the core household would prevent disagreements about family traditions and expectations. Daniel paused after explaining this, as if he understood how fragile that reasoning sounded when spoken aloud. I listened quietly, letting him finish before answering. I told him that the most painful part of the situation had not been missing the ceremony itself. It had been standing outside the gate realizing that someone in my own family believed the moment would be simpler if I were not present. Daniel sighed softly on the other end of the line. He said he now understood that the decision had created exactly the opposite effect. Instead of avoiding tension, it had introduced questions that could not easily be ignored. After we ended the call, I sat on the porch for a long time, thinking about how families sometimes drift into patterns of silence without realizing it. Small decisions go unspoken. Assumptions replace conversations. And eventually those quiet choices begin shaping relationships in ways no one originally intended. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped by again, this time without the excitement of graduation day, but with a calmer determination. He sat with me at the kitchen table where the compass still rested in its open box. He told me that his parents had continued their discussion after he went to bed the night before. His father had asked Aisha why she had not simply spoken with him before contacting the school. According to Ethan, she answered that she believed the decision was hers to make because she was organizing the event. Ethan shook his head slightly when he told me this, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that something important had been overlooked. I reminded him that families often face moments where respect must be rebuilt through honest conversation rather than quiet adjustments made behind the scenes. Ethan nodded thoughtfully and picked up the compass again. He said he planned to keep it with him when he left for college later that year because it reminded him of something important. A compass only works when it is allowed to point toward the true direction. If someone tries to hold the needle in place, it eventually drifts back to where it belongs. As he said this, I realized the story that began at the stadium gate had already changed more than anyone expected. It had forced our family to look directly at a decision that might otherwise have remained hidden. And sometimes the greatest value of truth is not the explanation it provides, but the clarity it brings to every step that follows. I woke the following morning with a quiet sense of peace that I had not felt in several days. The early sunlight moved gently through the kitchen window, painting soft golden lines across the table where the silver compass still rested. I carried my coffee to that same chair and sat down slowly, letting the stillness of the house settle around me. Life had a way of returning to its ordinary rhythm after even the most uncomfortable truths were spoken. Yet something inside our family had shifted in a way that would not easily return to the way it had been before. Later that afternoon, Daniel came by the house. It had been some time since he had visited alone, and I could tell from the moment he stepped inside that the conversation he wanted to have had weighed on him for several days. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same place where Ethan and I had talked earlier in the week. For a moment, he looked at the compass resting between us, and then back at me. He said he had spent the past 2 days thinking about how easily the situation could have been avoided if someone had simply spoken honestly from the beginning. I listened quietly while he explained that he had talked with Aisha again that morning. According to him, she admitted that removing my name had been her attempt to simplify what she believed might become a complicated family gathering. She had convinced herself that the decision would go unnoticed and that the day would move forward without conflict. But Daniel said the moment Ethan began asking questions, he realized how fragile that reasoning had been all along. Daniel looked down at the table for a moment before saying something that surprised me. He apologized, not because he had removed my name himself, but because he had allowed too many decisions in the family to happen without paying attention to how they might affect others. His voice carried the quiet humility of someone recognizing that silence can sometimes create as much harm as action. I told him that families do not stay strong because every choice is perfect. They stay strong because people are willing to acknowledge when something has gone wrong and then choose a better path forward. Daniel nodded slowly. Before leaving, he asked if he could take the compass to give to Ethan during their dinner that evening. I handed it to him carefully and told him the gift belonged to Ethan, just as it had from the beginning. That night my phone rang again. It was Ethan calling to thank me once more for the compass. He said his father had given it to him and told him the story behind it. Ethan explained that he had placed it on the small desk in his bedroom, where he was preparing for college later that year. He said that every time he looked at it, he would remember the lesson behind the entire week. A compass does not argue or force direction. It simply points toward what is true and waits patiently until people choose to follow it. When we ended the call, I returned to the quiet living room and sat for a moment beside the chair where Thomas used to read his newspaper each evening. I imagined him listening to the story unfold and smiling in that calm way he always had when life revealed one of its quiet lessons. Outside, the evening sky stretched wide and peaceful above the neighborhood. The moment at the stadium gate had once felt like the end of something important. Yet now I understood it had simply been the beginning of a truth our family needed to see. And sometimes the most powerful direction in life does not come from the road in front of you, but from the quiet needle of honesty that refuses to point anywhere else.